Welcome back to the Way of the Wandering Wizard. I am, as always, Robert Andrew Meredith Kennedy. I am a pure and open channel for the finest vibrations of divine love and light, made manifest here, in service to Gaia and those who travel with her. Though most folks know me as Bob the Wizard, some Gandalf Bob the Wise, many more as the Weirdo in the Kilt, and a lot more besides. In my last video, I had described a moment when quite literally I was experiencing Armageddon. So this little video I actually entitled Armageddon it, as in I'm really Armageddon it. Shortly following that explosion in my mind that I've just described, yesterday before my smoke, with this shockwave, the events that I will retell now are very much told from another's perspective. It was about that point, according to eyewitnesses, my family, that my eyes quite literally rolled back in my head. Possibly while I was seeing everything all went white and misty. When they rolled back, what my family recognised in my eyes was just not present. It's an unusual thing to have that described to you. But I'm very much aware that the person, the part of me that was in that situation is very much not the part of me that is talking to you now. I mean, throughout all my life, certainly since the accident, I've been aware that I've had an internal observer, myself, looking at myself in life for a purpose of learning, purpose of growth. That's the person that is now talking to you. Certainly not what I would describe as the ego in crisis, where I was 6 months ago. So I've mentioned that is probably the first time in this life that I can honestly say that I was experiencing hallucinations. Quite literally, an ordinary view in an ordinary place in my village with very concerned family members around me. And what I was experiencing was the Third World War quite literally going off, superimposed on that. Realities colliding. During the course of or following that explosion, I quite literally handed my missus off, pushing her away, almost rugby tackled my dear aged mother, lofting her out of the shockwave, where I promptly tried to turn round, carry her out of whatever was going on, and knowing that my leg was in a somewhat weakened state, basically fell to the ground, laying across her in some kind of protective pose, while the blast wave flew across the top of us. Became aware part of that process that my mum is just quite literally going, "Robert, stop, you're hurting me." And part of me snapped back into this reality, this experience of reality. I panicked, ran across the road to the pub. Get yourself away from the situation, get yourself something to drink. I was overloaded, overheated. I felt myself boiling from the inside out. I ran back across the road again, zigzagging through the traffic. Thankfully, the traffic was busy and slow. Otherwise, yet again, I would not be having this conversation with you, not unless you knew a very good medium or an extra large. I arrived in the pub, by all accounts, as covered in leaves. Beard stood out like a bristle brush. Looking like some insane hedge wizard and behaving like some insane hedge wizard demanding a drink. I mean, the natural assumption on being faced with that is that clearly they require alcohol. It wasn't necessarily what I was asking for. I just needed some fluids. Felt dry. In need of a tea, probably. The staff, quite rightly, as my poor mother headed home, and my good lady summoned help, had called the police, quite reasonably. Not a small gentleman. Wasn't exactly behaving like a gentleman at the time. fact I was just roaring out some mid-crisis, whatever was going on in my mind at the time, which was chaos, by the way. I have a vague memory of stood in the corner of the, basically exiting to the beer garden, being stood in the corner. Police stood off at a distance, me shouting, sitting at a table shouting. It sounds strange, but it's not an unfamiliar situation for me. Well, it's the first time it's happened to me in the real world, but I have been involved in those kind of training exercises. To be standing, screaming obscenities at policemen is not an uncommon experience for me. Does that justify my actions? No. But your mind in those states calls for any experience that's making sense of the chaos that's going on around us. Part of me think that I would have lost it in some kind of bizarre training experience, possibly. I don't know. At the time I was suffering with a massive UTI. I was hallucinating. One minute they were policemen, the next minute they were some hostile agency trying to take me away from my family. They then flip into some very strange and bizarre visuals. Mind driven and basically being kettled more and more after those explosions. At some point I have a vague memory of sort of coming back into the room, so to speak, and being aware that there was a mum and a child. I was screaming like a maniac, making demands for tobacco, making demands for water. Some kind of tribal chief negotiating my tribute. I have no idea what was really going on in their world, just from what's been described to me. Most definitely a mind in crisis. I was asked to move to the ambulance. In fact, the lady just sat there and said, "Love, you need to go somewhere." You know, she understood that I was there. She was actually a voice of reason. A complete stranger. I was aware of my actions even in that intense experience. I can remember vaguely apparently heading towards the ambulance, and at that minute the flight response kicked in and I saw a gap. I tried to dive back through the pub, sure that I could run through the pub and get out the other side by pulling chairs and chaos behind me. I got 2 steps in. And the simple fact is that I'm a mid-50-year-old broken biker. My days of Hussein bolting out of a situation are long gone. Apparently I have no memory of it. I got hold of a wine rack, it was attached to a wall, they weren't moving me. I've been in these experiences before physically. Now this is the point where, strangely, I've said before in my life journey, where these entrained experiences that I'd put myself through are probably there for a good reason. This was, although it was terrifying to part of me at the time, because of where my mind was, my body has been in that experience before, being restrained by policemen, being resistive to arrest. Did that keep a modicum of control? Yes. Because at no time have I been told that I lashed out. I hung on to things. I certainly shoved a few people around. But needless to say, in that particular capture scenario, I was restrained in handcuffs behind my back and marched to the ambulance, sat down, and quite sensibly accompanied by a number of policemen and a policewoman. Now at that point I was clearly in flight. I was feeling claustrophobic, was feeling overloaded, and strangely my body was starting to massively react because I was in an ambulance where 10 years before I'd been through a near fatal bike accident. I've been in ambulances in various states of pain. Not on account of fighting, on account of being run over, falling off of things. To say that my body was triggering by being back in that situation, particularly with the pain in my arms because they were held behind my back, my body absolutely convinced it must have been hit by a car again because all the pain was there while that was going on. It's the conscious part of me roaring for space to be left alone, just to get out of this situation that was overloading me, bringing up all my PTSD and just driving an already driven system. To have taken that overload And far from it dissipating, it had just built as the UTI built, and this was just the absolute point at which it burst. I have no memory of it. I would stand up periodically demanding space, raging at folk. I'm quite a big unit. Apparently if I stood up in the ambulance I'd fill the space. Naturally I was seen as a threat. Every time anybody tried to get near me I either would kick out at them, bite at them, spit at them. To say that from a point of observation now that I had quite literally gone into flight was absolutely in that point. Did I have any control? No. This conscious part talking to you now was present but unable to act because my survival mechanisms had kicked in. A body evolved for 16,000 years in those situations will overload immense strength. Everything gets overloaded to protect this which carries our consciousness. Certainly not an excuse for my behaviour. And now, on record, my apologies to those officers who were in attendance and to the paramedics that were also in attendance and to each and every member of the National Health Service, particularly the Mental Health Service, who basically bore the brunt of what unfolded over the course of the next 3 weeks. It was quite a journey. But at that epic level explosion, sitting in the back of that ambulance, overloaded by everything, a good friend who has allowed me to identify him as Raz. For those of you who know will know him. And in a situation like that, what you need by your side, covering your back, is yet another brother who's been there, seen it, bears the scars. Thankfully, due to his intervention, and even though his face, and I quite clearly will say this, his face was literally morphing between a childhood friend, someone that's been through all manner of shit with me through my life, to some colonel, past life, I don't know what it was. Recognising that he actually had some level of rank and authority, I don't know what was going on. But it was the one face in that sea of faces that was not hostile, or overloaded, or confused, or frightened. Although he was all of those at times. Just that anchor point. I have no idea what was going on. I was chuffing and puffing, trying to get into some kind of bizarre breathing pattern just to try and break my state. Now, strangely, at the point that to make light of a situation, I made a great claim that when I finally understood myself, when I knew myself and my consciousness was in a position to fully ascend, my hands would go purple. Guess what, folks? In that physical moment, my hands were purple because I'd been fighting in handcuffs. Still carry the scars to prove it. Because in that moment, absolutely overloaded, and primal instinct just takes over. Fight them off and get out. If you can't fight them off, find a way of reducing their numbers and get out. And that's pretty much what overloaded me for the next 3 days. Now clearly at some level I'd realised that I'd been overpowered by whatever was going on while my mind tried to make sense of it. I'd been restrained, though I see the sense of it now. At the time, that's not how my body was experiencing it. I was massively obstructive. I assaulted a number of officers by touching, not always in the most appropriate places. Anything to thin those numbers down. Now, the next part of my little journey is a blur. Apparently the negotiation alone to get me to lift my legs up and lie back on the dolly in the ambulance and allow them to put straps around me was a 40-something minute process. Give those of you from a grounded reality, and the fact that I'm laughing, some semblance of quite how far out of it I was. I would not move my feet for fear of losing myself unless I had a 6-figure grid reference for Ayers Rock in Australia, Uluru. That was the point at which I thought I was losing it. Didn't stand a chance of finding a body, but could probably find Ayers Rock. Was a frightening experience. The fact that I'm able to talk about it now, not from fear, is because I absolutely understand the process. It's just all too much happening at the wrong moment, or the right moment, for it all to come up to a massive head, and for all that shit that I'd carried to be cleared. It was not a pleasant process. I'll go on to give you some glimpses in the next little episodette, post Armageddon, which would be my experiences as I was taken through mental health service. Thank you for listening to the explosion that I went through 6 months ago, my own personal Armageddon. And I love the pun, yeah. It allowed me to finally say, I got it. Understand why it happened, what it brought up, what I had to see. And the simple fact is, as I mentioned in the last one, if you stand in that kind of level of whatever it was, after the experiences that I've shared for the last 10 years, near fatal bike accidents, up and down like yo-yos, dealing with post-traumatic stress, dealing with the stresses and strains, and not only having to cope with all of that, but having the same challenges that we all carried, that shit, plus having to deal with that during lockdown and whatever's flowed out since. I'd carried too much. I tried to kettle it down. I'd found venting mechanisms, but the fact is, when those floodgates opened, that's what poured out. Now, I'm an extreme example of life. I gathered that. It's how I choose to live my life. Believe me, having seen what I lived through in the mental health service, in a secure unit inside my mind over the next 2 weeks, more than showed me myself and what I'd done to deserve this. It goes to show the old adage, we get what we ask for, whether we want it or not. In my next little videoette, the wonderful Growler and I, who's here for my moral support, will share some rude awakenings as I progress my way through, as I've just mentioned, the mental health service. Thank you for listening. Take care, go well, and blessed be. And if in any way this video shows you a fraction of what you're going through, do what I've done. Please, find someone. Talk about it. Find ways to clear it. Express it safely before it overloads you. Or, if you do overload, let it boil out, and what will emerge will be very different for the experience. If your way is anything like mine.